Hello, everyone. This is a brief presentation on some introductory concepts that are derived from the field of ethnomusicology and another person that is involved with musicology from a sociological perspective. So this is a presentation to augment our thoughts about how do we analyze music, and especially when we're looking at musical form and musical elements. So this is going to be something that for you to integrate into your thinking while you do those types of processes. So I've prepared a few thoughts. These are introductory concepts. There could be more that we could consider, but today we'll just look at these. And primarily we're going to be looking at ways to get at the ideas and practices of music makers and how to include those when we think about music. Even going into the realms of human relationships that are involved in a musical experience. So this is just an overview of some thoughts and methods towards greater musical understandings. So to begin, we're going to unpack some assumptions that sometimes these become part of our frame of mind when we look at music, sometimes not. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to be more aware of this. And so let's unpack some of this. The ethnomusicologist Bonnie Wade emphasizes that as we study music around the world, there are three important areas to be open to. And because music is not necessarily a universal language, I suggest that we think about beginning at ground zero, and perhaps we could back up a bit and think about some of these things together. And so she encourages us to ask these three questions. Who are the music makers? Number two, what about this act of listening? And so I've kind of broadened out these ideas about what about participation or engagement with the music? Do these things matter? Such as, what do we know about the act of listening or receiving this music? And third, what is actually considered to be music in various culture groups, especially the ones that we tend to look at with more scrutiny? So let's begin. Who are the music makers? So try on these types of questions as the first steps in musical analysis and see if it opens up anything that you weren't considering before. So of course, we get to the basics. Are they instrumentalists, singers? Are they professionals or amateurs? Or are they everyday people, or are they specialists? So these pictures here show you that in some places of the world, such as in Ireland, when we have the pub music or sessions, Irish music sessions, sometimes they could be mixed. Some of the musicians could be amateurs and highly skilled or specialists. Sometimes I am aware of some traditions in China where amateurs get together once a week and play in a tea house. So let's try to keep that in mind, that sometimes music that we enjoy or music that we choose to share with our students or that we perform ourselves perhaps is grounded in some for amateurs and not just professionals. This other photograph is a picture of the Ukrainian National Choir. It's actually just a segment of that. And so we can see that they are emphasizing their identity through these traditional clothing, even though this may not be what they would wear every day. But this would be considered more of a professional group. The sound is cultivated with a particular aesthetic in mind. So who makes music and with whom? How do they learn this music? Is it brought to them through oral transmission, either through demonstration or shadowing a master artist? Or is it written down on music? And who gets to be the teacher in these music repertories as well? Who can perform and where? And I guess these are all dimensions of this. Who are the music makers? What is the status of musicians in these places? That sometimes can have an impact on things too. The second question, delving a little deeper, is this concept of an audience. And I put it in quotes because sometimes audiences can be informal or it can be a formal setting. So I like to extend her idea of the audience and move that into communal activities. Is there an expectation of just listening as a passive listener, or are they actually an active component of the musical experience? So this whole notion of participation or engagement brings up a lot of things to consider. So a lot of that will depend on the type of music. If it's religious, folk expressions, or art music, we think about the audience in a concert setting, for example, versus popular music at a concert. Even those are both concert settings. The expectation of the audience can be different. And then, of course, we can overlap with these musical types as well. So other questions to ask in this area of audience or engagement is this music done alone? Or is it originally connected to a particular kind of social activity? So here we have mariachi playing at a party. And a lot of times when we experience mariachi music or mariachi music, we think of it on a stage. They're highly arranged performances. They're famous groups, but we have to remember that mariachi is regionally based and they play music with at times varying instrumentation and also bringing in repertoire that other people might have heard before in folk music contexts. So it does move into many other social settings, such as weddings, the stage, etc. Another question to ask is, are there ever restricted audiences for certain types of music? Or I would offer in stronger contrast, might the audience be a critical part of that musical experience? Do musicians rely on the integration, like I think about some key African American traditions where audience engagement and participation is essential for it to work? Not just religious settings, but also popular music settings. So this kind of thinking might be a core principle in a particular cultural aesthetic system, and we just need to learn more about that, especially when we frame music within live performance as opposed to a recording. So I'm going to push this idea a little bit more just for a moment into this realm of what are cultural values and how do they affect music. So when we consider the realms of musical creation, which is what Bonnie Wade brings up, and or the notion of an audience, if we bring those realms into musical analysis, we can't ignore cultural values and how that impacts aesthetics. So I'm going to bring up some core examples in a minute here, but we need to know that music makers and the receivers of musical creation do come from an arena of cultural values, either consciously or unconsciously, and that's going to impact their work together. So one thing that comes up a lot in ethnomusicology is the role of the individual in musical creation, especially if the music maker is highly innovative and tends to bring in new ideas into their musical genre. I ran into this with my own dissertation when I focused on a creative individual. And when I prepared to provide my study into the field of ethnomusicology, I needed to acquaint myself with the debates that scholars have undergone. And some in the earliest years of ethnomusicology, like in the 1950s all the way to the 1980s, people were, especially in folk music studies, were highly suspicious of the creative individual because they felt like they were going to veer too much from tradition. And at that time, the scholars in folk music and ethnomusicology were trying to preserve and restore these forms so they wouldn't become lost. And so they didn't like it when people changed things at all. And yet the idea that music stays the same is really kind of, I think, a myth, that music always responds to the moment and is always changing. However, they also might remain grounded in some either conventions of performance practice or even some core aspects of that original song. So we have to think about things as continuity, but also change. And so I had to deal with, how do I situate a highly creative individual into a matrix of musical meaning for him? And so I did a lot of showing how what influenced him, and a lot of what influenced this artist I was studying was not only traditions that came from the region of Brazil where he worked, but also what the people needed in the community in which he served. And then, of course, he brought his own musical interests of other outside musical styles and pulled all that together. But when we think about music and meaning, this is really where we have to remember that individuals are grounded in a culture, and that culture presents cultural values about music and the way music should sound, or how music should function in the culture. So all of this is important when we get into meaning. So let's look a little bit about how cultural values can impact musical aesthetics, or the way the sonic qualities of music. And this is just a couple of brief points to bring out, and I'm going to use the case study of West Africa here. So what I have learned when I've studied African music was that cultural values provide a lot. And let's use the initial CV to represent that. So, for example, cultural values help to determine which events need music in the first place. And that means that if you want an event or a social activity to rise in a little bit more importance, usually music, and in the case of West Africa, if we're thinking about traditions, dance as well, get attached to these social activities. If a social activity is of importance for the community, there's going to be live music and usually dancing. So here is a photograph of a life cycle event of young girls moving into adulthood. And these become very important events when you present the young girls to the community. And there's always music and dance. It's highly animated with these two art forms. Cultural values can also affect what is considered for those people to be good quality musical sounds. What does it mean when they say, oh, that singer is a beautiful singer, or that performance lacked quality? Well, and even if a particular dimension of musical sound is missing. So I always give the example of the xylophone. And the xylophones sometimes have this buzzing quality, and it's built into the resonator, the gourds that are positioned underneath the marimba bars. If that buzz is absent, a lot of people from Ghana, for example, feel like something has been tampered with, and that instrument doesn't have the full quality of sound if you don't have that buzzy sound. Where for us, that buzzy sound can be kind of annoying. And when I say us, I mean in North American, if we've been trained through Western music training, we tend to think a buzz is a problem with the instrument. And so a lot of times people bring those instruments here and they get rid of that. And that's just moving into another cultural system of what means quality sound. So you can see here that these are images of dancers who have attached rattles to their ankles. And a lot of times the dance steps get marked with a musical sound as well. And that reinforces it, it underlines it in a way, or highlights it. So it becomes foregrounded. And those thickening of sound or adding layers to sound is a cultural value in this sense. Two other points of cultural values that I have found to be almost all over Africa, especially in Central and West Africa. So the idea that a live performance must be very good at communicating something. So usually live performance is grounded in communication. It isn't just, displaying musical virtuosity or for people to close their eyes and take in the sounds. It is about what is that music saying, and to bring that even further, that musical experience should change you. It should make you think about something that you weren't thinking about right before, or thinking about it in a different way. And so music must bring an impactful experience is the fourth cultural value. It must make an incredibly strong impression, so it moves you into a different state of mind or instills a memory of some sort that that you walk away from that experience with an impression, a strong impression. So here I use these images just to illustrate that usually there's some kind of narrative to African dance. It isn't just showing off moves. There's some kind of storyline there, or maybe it's an old folkloric story, or maybe it's something new that's being presented based on a problem that they're experiencing in their society at that time. And then this is why a lot of African music has drums that are quite large and that are loud. And the whole idea of volume is meant to make an impact in these outdoor settings. The third thing that Bonnie Wade brought up for us is what is really considered to be music? Well, she reminds us that music is not just organized sound, first of all, and that she suggests that music is not only a thing, but it's a process involving a lot of creative imagination. So here's a group of mariachi performers um, choosing to dress in a particular style of clothing for a live performance that communicates on so many levels about regional identity, Mexican identity, even if it's performed in the United States. And you notice that also this is a very unique formation. There's always a lot of creativity that's going behind a live performance. She states that our conceptions of what is really music should depend more and more on the culture group's attitudes and practices, and not just what we think when we hear something. We're like, oh, that's a nice song, or that's music. Well, we need to know what the people who are that music comes from, what they think about that, and what category of music they put it in, or what type of music they put it in. That's important for us to learn as well. And how do we learn that? Usually by asking, talking to them, or reading works by scholars who have done very careful work in these various settings. She suggests that we can also notice how those ideas are applied then to ensembles, their repertories, their social occasions in which they bring that music, and even to dance, because dance might become an important part of what is considered the music. Okay, so what is considered to be music is, again, just getting back to this idea of the culture group that we're looking at. So for example, in Islamic belief, melodic religious expressions such as the call to prayer is not necessarily a thing, but more often is really an activity. So we're dealing here with, is music a noun or is it a verb? Is it something we do? And the doing of music is what brings intense levels of meaning. So we need to remember that in the act of expression or the receiving is really where meaning enters the picture. And so the call to prayer, which we might think of singing, and actually I did for many years, but it's actually considered more like chant and not singing. It's an act of chanting. It's an act of praying. And it's a highly devotional praying, and this is not just a musical text that is being delivered, nor a performance per se, but it's engaging a state of prayer. And so even though we see similar musical and performative practices that take place between this kind of music and Western European music, perhaps at times we need to remember maybe it's not called music, or it's not thought of as music. And you will encounter this when you read anytime about the call to prayer Islamic chant. So there is, one thing that is interesting though is that there will be similarities. So for example, in Islamic melodic theory, there's a lot of similarities to things that we might have learned in musical training at music school, such as there are usually scale types, or in this case, a mode. Or there might be ways that the person who chants a melodic rendition will bring ornamentation, may bring an individualized rendition to that action of putting the music out there, or putting the sounds out there. So again, we're going to see, even within the Arab world that has so many different ideas about music, there are things that are shared. And some of that has to do with, there's a lot of Arab influence in throughout history on music, especially that was generated during the medieval period in Spain and Portugal. They actually were there in the Iberian areas of the world for 700 years. So it's hard to ignore this influence. So what is music? Is it a thing, or is it an activity, or can it be both? And how can we include both thing and activity in the analysis of music? So now I'd like to bring up some ideas finally from this musician and composer, Christopher Small. He coined this term musicking, which is music as a verb. Some of you who are listening to this presentation might be familiar with this. And he suggests that we conceive of music in terms of actions and not just as songs or a set of songs. Those, he says, are merely just musical objects, and it isn't music or musicking per se. So he brings up this idea that certain kinds of activities surrounding musical objects or musical action are just as important as the musical object itself. And some of the acts that he addresses in many of his writings are creating music, performing music, listening, rehearsing, imagine, practicing, composing, and in some cases, dancing. He even includes some other interesting things like the people who move the pianos from the room onto the stage. Are they part of this musical milieu that, social arena in which music is generated and received? All of this in the environment of musical action could be important. It's very interesting ideas. So again, we're going to return to this idea of meaning, musical meaning. And when we get to this level of meaning, this is where Christopher Small's ideas might be interesting for us to consider. He spoke to a group of music educators at MENC National Conference, and these are just a few excerpts from his talk there. This was in the 1990s, I believe. So, quote, "If we want to discover where musical meaning resides, we have to ask not, what does this musical work mean, which is the question to which the overwhelming majority of modern Western musical criticism, aesthetics, and theory is devoted, and for that matter, modern music education. We ask rather, what does it mean when this performance takes place at this time, in this place, with these participants?" I find this to be a very profound and important question, even as we move forward as performers. This is the kind of thing I think about all the time when I create a percussion accompaniment for a choir, for example. I have to bring in these questions. So to answer that question or these questions, we have to explore the extremely complex set of relationships that are established in the performance space in the course of the performance. We should notice, by the way, that the second question, what does the performance mean, doesn't negate the first, what does this musical work mean? We should notice, sorry, I jumped ahead. It doesn't negate that first question, but rather it subsumes it into a larger and more comprehensive and much more interesting question. And of course, in much human musicking, there isn't a written down or even a fixed musical work at all, in which case the first question is meaningless. It's very interesting. Okay, so my training in ethnomusicology talked a lot about text versus context. And then as I was preparing to do my own fieldwork, two of my professors brought this up a lot because they knew I was a very accomplished musician in terms of percussion, and then I wouldn't have any problem grasping the musical text. And what that means is the arrangement, the sounds, the rhythms that are being put out there. But I needed to remember that there was a context for that. And probably the longer I would have been in Brazil, I would have understood that context even more, not just in terms of meaning, but the historical context and all the people who came into that picture from when I wasn't even there and who would be there in the future as well. So Christopher Small goes on to talk about these relationships in this talk, and you may find that a very important, critical thing to think about as we work on peace building in the classroom. So I recommend reading this essay based on his address, Whose Music Do We Teach Anyway? And the next slide, I will show you that. But also, he has a book titled Music of the Common Tongue, Survival and Celebration in African American Music, which he wrote in 1987, where he gets into these ideas quite a bit. Here is a link to his, this is the essay from the address in which he prepared for music teachers at the National Conference in Washington, D.C. on March 28th, 1990. So these ideas for this presentation came from Bonnie Wade's text, thinking musically, experiencing music, expressing culture. And this provides just a little bit of background on her as a ethnomusicologist. She obtained her MA and PhD from UCLA, and she is a leader in the field both as an educator and a scholar. She's taken on many leadership roles in the field. Her expertise is in the music from Japan. She's also done work on Hindustani music from South Asia and vocal traditions from North India. In addition to these roles, she has co-edited the World Music Curriculum, the Global Music Series for Oxford University Press. And this is a link to her faculty webpage. And then, of course, Christopher Small, who was a New Zealand-born musician, educator, lecturer, composer for the screen, stage, and orchestra. He's also the author of a number of influential books, and he has many ethnomusicologists have spent time thinking about his ideas. So he is responsible for coining this term musicking as a verb, with which he wanted to highlight that music is a process and not merely an object. One more scholar, Gabriel Solis, that you might be interested in this article, Thoughts on an Interdiscipline, Music Theory, Analysis, and Social Theory in Ethnomusicology. So that is all I have for you on this. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll continue with other ideas in the future. Take care. Bye-bye.